And welcome back now to Face the Nation. Here with our panel, Kimberley Strassel is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Jeffrey Goldberg writes for The Atlantic. Jan Crawford is our chief legal correspondent. We'd also like to welcome Sherrilyn Ifill to Face the Nation. She is the president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. And last but not least, the White House correspondent for the New York Times, Peter Baker. I want to talk a little bit about civil rights and where we are on that. And I would just start by asking the panel. You saw the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It's become kind of an icon in its own way in the whole civil rights movement. Does anybody here know who Edmund Pettus is?
Yes, he was a senator, he was a Confederate general, and he later led the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama.
He was the Grand Dragon
yes, he was.
of the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama. Some of the things you don't know until you go to the site. I had no idea.
Is it marked? Does it say that?
Well, that's his name right across the
No, but
top.
does it acknowledge anywhere
No,
that?
it just says Edmund Pettus, but it's one of those things that's up there, and down through the years, I think people have just forgotten. And
well, everybody there knows.
That's what you find out, which shows why you ought to go to where something is happening as a journalist to find out. Where are we right now? Jan, you of course are a native of Alabama. Is Alabama different than it used to be?
Oh, completely. And I thought, as Congressman Lewis said in your interview, we can't lose sight of the fact of how much has changed, because that does a disservice when you think about how much people before us sacrificed for that change. But yet, as we've seen on a number of civil rights issues, whether it's race, same-sex marriage, there still is a long way to go. But you also see in Alabama, and I've been down a couple times in the last week, for example, with the same-sex marriage controversy, you see great hope. You see people looking to advance change in the state of Alabama, as you see across the nation. So while we had people sacrificing 50 years ago, I think we still have that today, not only in Alabama, but across the country.
Well, while Edmund Pettus's name is still on that bridge, Judge Ballard, who's the probate judge in that courthouse, he got up Saturday morning and went and opened up the courthouse for us so we could conduct that interview, and as it often is in the South, made coffee for everybody. And when we came over there to do that interview, as you saw with John Lewis, he came out on the front steps and said, "Welcome. We're glad to have you."
But it's just incredible to think that there are people alive today, our parents or say our grandparents, who couldn't drink out of the same water fountains.
Yeah.
That is still, that wasn't that long ago.
Well, that's the
when you think
challenge
about
for
it.
us, is to be able to keep in our head the two things, that we've made extraordinary progress,
but
we have a really long way to go. And you really said it, Bob, in the setup for this, when you said that these people walked across the bridge and they changed America for the better. And I think that's what we have to understand. When we see these protests happening today about police violence against unarmed African Americans, it's going to make this country better. We're at a moment where change does have to happen. When you hear the FBI director, as he did this week, talking about implicit bias and talking about the way in which law enforcement does have bias that has to be dealt with, and there has to be training. We're at a moment where we have the opportunity to make real change, and that's what civil rights does. It makes America better, and we can't be afraid of the moment. I think John Lewis said it best, we gotta face it.
But also the nature of the problems have changed. I mean, the Comey speech, it got so much attention because it was an FBI director saying police officers have bias. What was more interesting in that speech to me was him talking about why it is. He said, we cannot reduce this to a debate about policing tactics. We have to talk about why we have bias. And that gets back to the fact that problems have changed. We have a social and cultural issue in a lot of African American communities across the country about violent crime. And that was part of his speech, saying, how do we address those root causes? Because this is part of the problem, that people looking at each other is, how do you actually deal with that?
What was fascinating, and what's been fascinating to me, is how long this issue of police violence has kind of been really at the center of concern in African American communities, and how it's now kind of surfaced over the last year and kind of everyone's engaging it. What was interesting about Comey's remarks is it's the one thing that was omitted And that's so important if you talk to young people in communities all over. And it's about this issue of accountability. We still haven't heard any prominent law enforcement official saying, we understand the need for training, we understand there has to be supervision. And when something goes wrong, when a life is taken, an innocent life is taken, there has to be accountability. And I've talked to people, all over this country. That's what they're waiting to hear. That means the sea
wasn't that
change.
what Comey was saying, though? I mean, I thought this speech, which made the front page of most newspapers, I thought it maybe didn't get as much attention as it should have. I mean, I think it's going to be remembered as a remarkable speech in the history of this country.
It's fascinating. If you look back at FBI history, you got to place this in context. The day after the I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, the top aide to J. Edgar Hoover wrote him a memo. William Sullivan wrote Hoover a memo saying that we must target Martin Luther King as we must mark him as the most dangerous Negro of the future. I mean, that was the language that they used. So it's an incredible leap forward for the FBI, and I'd rather be uncharacteristically positive about this in the sense that I'm a journalist, so I look for the negative, obviously. But the fact that this was an FBI director talking about inherent bias or racial bias that is unconscious is quite a remarkable achievement. I think you're right. I think it will be. On the other hand, just a very quick point on your Edmund Pettus point, it is remarkable that we're having a debate in this city about the name of the Washington football team. But when you go to the South and you find that on bridges and highways, you have the names still of Grand Dragons of the Ku Klux Klan. That's a remarkable thing. I find that remarkable.
But Lewis has been asked if should we change the name of that bridge, because of, and he has suggested no, that it's important that people remember.
Well,
and,
I think
have the
in
name.
fact it's actually the point that was made earlier, that what would be great is to have the plaque that says who Edmund Pettus really was, so people can get the full context. I mean, I think that's part of, like, the history of this country needs to be kind of explained in a way. There are all these places where we have these encounters. You saw the New York Times do this big story about lynching, where these things happen. We need these kind of notices so we understand what happened in that space.
Peter.
The other thing I think it's important to remember, though, is, and because we are negative as journalists, Comey's speech was important, landmark, and said a lot of interesting things, but go beyond the speech. Where is the FBI today in terms of its own diversity? Our colleague, our friend Josh Gerstein wrote a piece pointing out that it's still under 5% of the FBI is African American at this point.
Which is the same percentage as the Ferguson Police Department.
Yeah, in the year 2015. I think part of it is, we have a president who's African American. We think, okay, therefore diversity is more or less taken care of because we got it at the top. That doesn't actually mean that, throughout the various layers of government, various layers of authorities, that has in fact taken hold. In fact, President Obama is going to be going to Selma, I think, in a few weeks to bring up this issue, which is interesting for him because it's a topic where he's had some interesting back and forth on how out front to be on.
It's a catch-22 on diversity and policing, because I think the Gerstein piece even suggested that, and I think Comey has said, the FBI has a hard time attracting young African Americans to want to be in the FBI, and the Ferguson Police Department has a little difficulty attracting African Americans to want to be police officers. So that's part of why changing and transforming who law enforcement really is in African American communities is going to be important if you want to move that diversity.
Let me ask you about this awful thing that happened down in Chapel Hill, where you had the 3 Muslim students who were shot execution style by this guy. They're saying they're going to investigate it as a hate crime. I think it's more of a nut crime myself, if I could put it in those kind of terms. But what's the take here at this table?
We just don't know enough yet. I mean, this guy was a focus of the community, the killer. They'd had meetings about him. He was angry all the time. He was yelling at people, not just about parking spots, but about music and noise. There might have been a mental health issue there, too. I think it was unfortunate a little bit that the president came out and instantly suggested that this had, in fact, been done
without prejudging the facts of the case. I think he was angry at everyone in the community, but somehow it was 2 Muslim women in hijab and a Muslim man who got the brunt of it. I'm not, I'm not speculating, or I'm not trying not to speculate about it, but clearly it's worthy of investigation.
But here's another part of it. What business did he have being out there with a gun? I mean, if he'd gone out there with a baseball bat, he might have hit one of them in the head, and
I'd rather
somebody
he
might
not
have
be
been
armed
hurt.
at all.
But with guns like they are today, you just and you've killed 6 or 7 people.
I mean, we should be cautious. The Justice Department actually isn't investigating it as a hate crime. They're investigating the predicate of the killing to determine whether there should be a hate crimes investigation. So they're taking the slow steps of figuring this out. And I think, Jeff is right. At the end of the day, there are 3 Muslims killed. I heard a Muslim young person say, our parents now feel they have to have the talk with us that African American parents have with their children. Even if it evokes that feeling, it's a very serious moment. And so I think we'll see as the Justice Department goes through this investigation what really happened here. But I think there's enough there that we should be deeply concerned about the implications of this killing.
And there was also in Alabama in the last week, an Indian a grandfather visiting his son who was studying in Huntsville was beaten, thrown down, and now is hospitalized. But of course, law enforcement there fired the officer. It was videotaped. So obviously, these are affects people across the board.
All right, we're going to take a little break and come back and talk about some of the other issues of the day in 1 minute.